Welcome to Plastics News Live, our editorially driven live event. I'm Don Loepp, editor of Plastics News, and today we'll be talking about the economic outlook for the plastics industry, specifically on the shape of the recovery from the slowdown that we've seen in 2020 from the coronavirus pandemic. My guests today are Bill Wood, economics editor of Plastics News, and Perc Pineda, chief economist with the Plastics Industry Association. Before we get started, this is a live event, and we encourage you to ask questions. You can ask a question anytime by clicking on the Q&A icon in the right-hand corner of your computer screen and typing in the question. Before we get started, here's a word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is the Plastics Industry Association. Plastics is the association representing the entire plastics supply chain globally, from materials and equipment suppliers to processors, converters, and recyclers. Partnering with leading brand owners, we give innovative companies the opportunity to shape our industry's future. Benefits include reduced price access to over 35 industry events each year, including one of the world's largest international plastics trade shows, NPE The Plastics Show, taking place next year, 2021, in Orlando, Florida. To help your business thrive, Plastics provides valuable connections to industry peers, exclusive economic data, the latest standards and regulatory information, and a voice in every state and the nation's capital. At Plastics, our goal is your success. Visit plasticsindustry.org or call 202-974-5212 to learn more. Okay, let's get started, and we'll start by introducing our guests. Perc, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Don. Good afternoon, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Perc Pineda. I'm the chief economist of the Plastics Industry Association. I serve as the association's resource person in economics and industry research. I'm responsible for producing the reports that our members see on a regular basis, two of which on an annual basis, the Global Trends Report and the Size and Impact. We also have the Market Watch reports, we have the Plastics Quarterly Forecast, and we have the first ever annual Plastics Business Outlook. And we're going to unroll that for the third time in July. I am happy to be part of this multifaceted industry. I came from two other trade associations. In one, I was doing market access and regulatory affairs management, and in another one, I was a senior economist. But this is an industry that's not a cookie cutter manufacturing industry. There are a lot of moving parts, and I'm proud to be part of it. There's a lot of opportunity to engage with members, to engage with even the critics of the plastics industry. And so I am very excited to share some of my views and insights of how the shape of economic recovery as it pertains to plastics will be unfolding as I see it from where I'm sitting in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Perc. Bill, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Don. Hello, Perc. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Again, Bill Wood, and when I am not specifically engaged in activities of economics editing for Plastics News magazine, I spend the rest of my time trying to get a grip on reality. And I think that's very common for people right about now. And to do that, my favorite and particular way of doing that is looking at hundreds of charts, data points, data sets, tables every single day, all day long. That's it. I sit in front of my computer and look at charts, hoping to divine out trends, insights, opportunities, threats, and believe it or not, I've been doing that even more than usual since we shut down the economy, trying to find a way to navigate this. I'm very excited about sharing some of my ideas, insights, what I've learned, what I'm seeing, try to support it with some data, not some anecdotes. But that's the kind of thing I've been doing for 35 years for the industrial markets. And most of that time I have spent toiling away the data that pertains to the plastics industry. And one of these days I'm gonna get to where I'm good at it. But till then, I keep practicing.
We've been through a few cycles, haven't we, Bill?
We have. We've seen a few. I don't know if we've seen them all. I thought I'd seen everything. I haven't.
Yeah. So we're going to jump right into it with a big picture question. So the Congressional Budget Office published a bleak forecast yesterday. The unemployment rate will spike to around 16% next quarter and will remain in double digits through early 2021. GDP will drop sharply this quarter, 38% at an annual rate, before snapping back later this year. But the plastics industry might be a different story. Many companies have remained open, despite stay-at-home orders in many states, deemed essential industries. Molders, extruders, thermoformers, and fabricators have been busy making PPE like face shields and gowns, swabs, and plastic components for ventilators and test kits. Bill, looking at the big picture, what's your outlook for the economy and the North American plastics industry for the next few quarters?
I would say it like this. You set up the question by saying it was a bleak forecast. I agree with the numbers. I don't have anything better than the Congressional Budget Office on the numbers and the trajectory. I will say this. I don't see that as bleak, or because of the following reasons. We are past the bottom. We are now into recovery. We are climbing our way out of the hole. It will take, if you read the same forecast, they say about 6 to 8 quarters for GDP to get back to where it was before this. That would put us at the end of next year on their best case scenario. I think that sounds about right. I think that the good news is that we will be on a trajectory that feels like and looks like it is rising. I think that the plastics industry, the North American plastics industry, will be back to where they were prior to this sudden drop. Before that, I think they will get back there sometime next year, probably ahead of the overall economy for the reasons that you mentioned. So because there are many segments and large segments that actually are doing fine, food packaging and that kind of thing. So there are some segments which we'll talk about in greater detail later that will be playing catch up. But I think that overall it's we're looking up. We're going to move up and to the right from here.
Good. That sounds positive. Perc, so a few weeks ago, you predicted that the plastics industry production would drop 10 to 12% this year with a modest rebound next year. Is that still your outlook? And if so, what factors went into that prediction?
At the moment, our forecast continues to evolve depending on the monthly data that we're getting. We are in the process of updating our forecast for the next quarter, which will be released sometime in July, which will also coincide with the next release of the Plastics Business Outlook Index. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the Congressional Budget forecast, if I could say a few words about that, is really based on current regulation. So there are new regulations, for example, the fiscal policy stimulus that's being unrolled. And if we get another $3 to $6 trillion worth of fiscal policy support, then that would really change the CBO's forecast when we get into June or July for the second half of the year when they revise their forecast. And considering that the plastics industry is a mature industry, meaning that it will track the growth of the economy, particularly GDP, I think that our forecast for this year would be about the same. The quarter by quarter forecast would probably vary depending on data. For example, in the first quarter, we said that plastics products production would actually decrease by 4.3%. In reality, what happened is we only saw a 1.8% decline in plastics production in the first quarter. So as you can see, we may have overestimated the effect of the coronavirus pandemic in the first quarter. Will that be the same case in the second quarter? That's still a big question because data continues to come in in a different structure. And a good example is some of the things have already bottomed probably, as what consists of what Bill was saying. If you look at North American auto production, for example, in April, it was down year over year by 99.6%. So it's almost like the whole auto production in North America has actually stopped. Now, you can't possibly go worse than that. And so then that would be improving in the next coming periods, particularly now that the auto industry has started to return to work, or reopened rather. And so there are positive things in the economy along that line, but there are still questionable and risks, downside risks are still around. Particularly, we don't really see how fast the labor absorption capacity of the economy is going to be. Unemployment rate would probably continue to be in double digits. And in fact, if you look at U6 unemployment, it is already 22.8% at the moment. And some economists would argue that it's actually a better measure of unemployment because it adds marginally employed, those working part-time, those who have given up on looking for a job. And so it's really higher than the 14.7% that we see as the official rate. And so is it going to be that bad? Probably not as bad as what we thought of initially. But one thing is certain is that we're going to see a turnaround next year, definitely.
Okay, so let's talk about the timing and the shape of the recovery, and we'll keep this with Perc initially. What are your thoughts on the timing and sort of what steps will be important? What steps are we going to have to see that will know the industry is on the right track?
We will know if the industry is in the right track if we see that the job losses in the plastics industry have started to diminish. For example, in the first quarter, in March rather, we lost 200 jobs in the plastics and rubber manufacturing. And then in April, we lost 65,500 workers in the plastics and rubber industry. So if that number starts to decrease and the unemployment claims, particularly in the states where we have the most plastics employees, California, Ohio, Michigan, Texas, Pennsylvania, Illinois, New York, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. Once we see the unemployment claims there starts going down, then we will know that the plastics industry is actually turning around. At the moment, you can still divide a line between plastics for consumer essentials and plastics for non-consumer essentials. Those that are serving the consumer essentials portion of the economy, the plastics industry is serving that portion, are actually doing not as bad. Demand for some of these products are actually stable. Food packaging, healthcare, medical equipment and supplies, for example. But for the non-essentials, big ticket items like appliances and auto, they're not really doing great at the moment because it's basically a function of the state of the economy. High unemployment rate, declining real disposable income, and it feeds into the profit and the revenue and the bottom line of the plastics industry.
Okay. So, Bill, let's explore the unemployment situation a little bit. I watch very closely for companies that are laying off workers either permanently or temporarily. And in the plastics end of things, other than the automotive sector, which is a pretty big other than, there haven't been a lot. Obviously, when we're looking at the big picture of the U.S. economy, North American economy, a lot of the layoffs have been in the service sector. So maybe a little bit less in plastics, but there obviously have been some. So which industry sectors do you think will recover first, and are there any sectors that you think won't recover at all?
The sectors that the way this will, I think, unfold so that we can get a sense of recovery. First of all, the plastics industry, as Perc mentioned, is so widespread and diverse. We have almost the entire economy is our in market. But if you look at the data and start to track on the cyclical things, the first thing that actually has to bounce back for this economy to get on track is the service sector. About 2/3 of all consumer spending is on services. And services in this quarter that we're currently in and in the first quarter suffered the biggest decline spending. And by services, a lot of those are very plastic intensive. And you think about barbershops and beauty salons. You can think about landscaping, janitorial services, all using products that are made of plastic or packaged in plastic. But the biggest decline in service spending in the first quarter, and this is truly the meaning of the word irony, was in healthcare services. Almost all routine and elective type of procedures canceled. And so that'll be the first thing, I think, going to the dentist, going to the doctor, elective surgery, getting your knee replaced, getting that back on the schedule, that kind of thing. So we start to see the services. The second thing will be the restaurant industry and the hospitality industry, hotels. That was the second biggest decline. Another thing is recreation. And I think on that, we have entertainment services. That's where things get a little bit foggy for me. I don't know how we're going to approach entertainment and recreation. On the one hand, things like stay-at-home recreation, Netflix and video games and home workout facilities, gyms and equipment and crafts are all doing quite well. So to the extent that that's one of your industries, you probably are already in recovery or beyond recovery. You may actually see a slight downshift or a rotation out of those kinds of products. Transportation services, we know airlines, we know taxis, we know Uber. Those kinds of things, again, they're going to be so highly regulated, not clear to me how that's going to work. If I'm an Uber driver, do I have the money and the time to wait the 6-month lag time to get a plastic shield between my front seat and my back seat so that I can go back into business and meet OSHA requirements? So the service sector is going to be critical. It's critical to our economy. After that, we already have the consumer non-durables, food packaging, and those kinds of things haven't really changed. There might be, like I say, some rotation out of that. And then, as Perc mentioned, we're going to have to, later in the chain, we'll see the consumer durables, which automobiles, electronics, home furnishings, those kind of appliances. Those are the sectors that will move later. It will be interesting to see the mix, how many employees each one of those segments actually accounts for, and the mix of the employment data on those. But that'll be the way it unfolds. When you start to see data on first of all, these basic services, and then a little bit later as it shifts into consumer durables, more expensive items. That's how I see the recovery unfolding.
Okay, good. Let's talk about supply chains, because that's something that it's been on the plastics news pages the past few weeks. People looking at supply chains and how they might be changing, maybe a market perception of Chinese products, the fact that there were difficulties in some of the, especially on the medical end. We'll start with Perc. Do you expect to see a realignment of supply chains? And if so, like maybe to what extent will that happen? I don't think anybody expects everything to be reshored to North America, but will there be mild reshoring, aggressive reshoring, and if so, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's hard to say because reshoring really takes on different forms and it happens in stages, and some of which are just so capital extensive that it would vary depending on the size of the organization and what you can really afford. There will be initially some shifts of sources of imports, for example, and I think that's going to happen. Whether or not we'll see a full-blown trend of reshoring into the United States, despite the fact that this crisis has actually opened the eyes of a lot of Americans and all businesses that you need to have a second line source of supply, and you need to have enough inventory, particularly for emergency. And so there will be some regulatory reasons to do some reshoring in the United States. but it's difficult and it would vary from industry. For example, if you think about the auto industry, and there are a third of over 30,000 parts in automobiles are plastics. If you think about the auto industry, 95% of our imports of motor vehicles and parts comes from 16 countries. That's it. That's 95%. And so to be switching from one country to another, it's going to be a challenge. Canada used to be the third largest source of imports for that area, but now they're the second largest imports for motor vehicles and parts, and China actually dropped to the third part. There are lots of items, big items, for example, in autos that you want to be close to the manufacturing facility. Door panels, all those big parts for automotives, you need to be closer to the facility. And it's actually costly to be retooling and doing all this other parts. So there are lots of things to look at and lots of things to consider before reshoring. But it would be a missed opportunity if plastics industry companies or companies in the plastics industry wouldn't even look at this possibility, because for business continuity reasons, for obvious reasons rather, I think they should really consider doing it, particularly for emergency reasons. So there will be some form of reshoring. To the extent that how it's going to be, whether it's going to be pervasive across the industry is a big question. And it's going to happen gradually, because business would have to do their due diligence. Is it financially feasible? What's the ROI? What's the payback period? And all those kinds of things. So it's difficult to say and how that will shape itself as the coronavirus pandemic actually eases.
Okay, good. Bill, let's direct a similar question to you. Perc talked about opportunities. I talked with a processor about a week ago who was saying in their mind, this is the time to be aggressive about reshoring opportunities. Basically, your argument's been made for you. This is the time to go to the OEMs and be aggressive about it, because they'll be open to the idea. Do you agree that it's the right time to push this? And how receptive do you think OEMs would be to North American plastics supply chain arguments in favor of reshoring?
I 100% believe this is the right time. Push this. And it has been the right time since before this happened. This is just the opportunity. This is the risk that was on the horizon that was inevitable. But it's not the only risk. It's not the only type of risk. If you factor in things like geopolitical risk, if you talk about the transportation, how do you know that somebody isn't going to, some terrorist isn't going to start targeting cargo ships as they cross the Pacific? How do you know the insurance company isn't going to start raising the price on insuring those loads? Never mind the election that's coming up and how we get along with China after that. If you can't go out and make a value proposition case to reshore, especially in light of the fact that we recently passed a new trade deal with both Canada and Mexico, if you can't make the value proposition that you need to reshore your supply chain, your manufacturing, then you're just not trying. Now, I will say this with response to your question about how receptive. I don't think there's a manufacturer on this continent that isn't receptive to that message, that wouldn't sit down and listen to that doesn't understand almost everything I just said. The problem is going to be market acceptance and the price adjustments. And the reason that our supply chain was so far flung was almost entirely due to cost. And so I think right now what we have is the opportunity to make the case that you didn't really avoid cost by going overseas. You really didn't lower your risk. You raised your risk. You put those costs off till the future. You externalized them till down the road. You're paying for it now. And that will certainly still be the case once we get past this coronavirus problem. I think that keeping supply chains for strategic reasons as well as economic reasons nearby just makes so much sense. So I've been a strong proponent of that since the WTO gave China the most favored nation status. And when I saw what it did to some of our mold makers and some of our other domestic industries, my mind on that hasn't changed. It's only become more convinced.
Okay, good. So about a year ago, if we had been having this conversation, we probably would have started out with some discussion of the circular economy and sustainability and the impact that that's going to have on plastics. So Perc, has that all gone away, or if it has, is it temporary, or is there going to continue to be an emphasis on making plastics a circular material and closing the loop on recycling and what impact will that have on plastic?
Well, the positives that we're getting today because on the plastics, the positives that plastics are receiving because of benefits it has provided the healthcare workers and all the society, for that matter, in containing the virus, I think is only going to be temporary. And I say that because we have to keep in mind that the critics of plastics are well organized and well funded. What would be permanent will be the opportunity to continue to educate and advocate for the industry. I think that's not going to change. At the moment, we have seen some delay in plastic bag bans. I think there are 10 states that have actually done that. In terms of localities, there are 99 localities that have actually temporarily suspended enforcement of single-use plastic bags. So that's a positive. And if it would inform a greater number of consumers that the positive impact of plastics is really something that they should keep in mind all the time and not be swayed by all of our critics, and I think that's an achievement on itself. But moving forward, as I said, I think it's going to be temporary. I'm sure these groups will group, for lack of a better term, and as I've said, not to sound repetitive, they're well funded and they're well organized, and they would take a snipe at us once the whole thing is actually over. But one thing though that we should also remember is that at this point, I think consumers are now more aware that it's really the choice of the consumer that matters in a market economy. Bans do not work; they haven't worked, and it's really stifling consumers' choice, and that's not really good for the economy. Particularly if you're in a crisis situation, you have to give consumers choice, and this is one positive image and message that the plastics industry actually offers.
So, Bill, bag bans have been delayed. We saw actual positive coverage of the Braskem plant, which stayed open with the workers sleeping in the plant for a month, working 12-hour shifts and not seeing their families. Is the market perception and public perception of plastics changing? And do you think that it's a permanent change?
I don't know about market perception. I do think that there will be some change and it will be permanent. I want to divide the problem with plastic and plastic bans and what we're being attacked with into kind of two camps. And one of them, we really lost the high ground, and we have to regain that. And that was the industrial waste, pellets in the wetlands, and that kind of thing. To the extent that our opponents in this thing are showing pictures of the oceans, and all the wasted plastic out in the oceans, to the extent that any of that is post-industrial, that's a business or a company that it ended up in there, that's inexcusable. And we lost the high grounds because that's who they're going to attack. The real problem, in my opinion, is post-consumer. And it's the consumer, and Perc had alluded to it, but it's going to be a monumental effort because culturally we just are not, we're just not attuned to accepting ownership of our waste products. We put those out on the side of the road, and that's the end of it. We think we're done with that, and we expect some municipal service or somebody else to take care of that for us. And we don't know if they get recycled or if they get bundled up and landfilled or whatever happens to it. We just do not care. And that's going to take, that's where the inertia is. That's the tremendous thing. It's very easy to tell somebody, a consumer, that plastics are bad when they really don't want to take ownership for their use of the plastic. And I think we lost the high ground when they caught some companies, you know, in the documentaries and stuff that were major polluters and they shouldn't have been. I think we also lose the high ground when we just let it come down to bags. To have a sustainable economy, to have a green economy, to have an economy going forward that optimizes the resources, that puts the most people to work, that minimizes the cost for the most consumers, we absolutely positively have to have a vibrant plastics industry. We cannot do what we want to do with any other material. Most of the products that we think are important in our lives in some way or another have to do with plastic. And we have to, if we're going to, reduce our energy consumption, if we're going to feed the world, if we're going to do all of these things, plastic is going to play a major role. And so to the extent that we can educate consumers, we can be a strong advocate for the industry, we can direct the narrative to the root causes and the real problems and show that we are making progress in solving those problems. That's a change in some of the choice we can make, and it can be permanent. As long as we commit to it ourselves, that can be permanent.
Okay, well, we're gonna pause for a minute for another word from today's sponsor, and then when we come back, we'll look at some other end markets in detail and some plastic sectors, and we'll get to all of our viewer questions. So today's sponsor is the Plastics Industry Association. Be connected, be heard, be represented, be involved with the Plastics Industry Association. Plastics is the association representing the entire plastics supply chain globally, from materials and equipment suppliers to processors, converters, and recyclers. Partnering with leading brand owners, we give innovative companies the opportunity to shape our industry's future. Benefits include reduced price access to over 35 industry events each year, including one of the world's largest international plastics trade shows, NPE, the Plastics Show, taking place next year, 2021, in Orlando, Florida. To help your business thrive, Plastics provides valuable connections to industry peers, exclusive economic data, the latest standards and regulatory information, and a voice in every state and the nation's capital. At Plastics, our goal is your success. Visit plasticsindustry.org or call 202-974-5212 to learn more. Okay, so let's start by getting into some of the sectors, and we'll start with Perc. Let's talk about plastics machinery. That's one of the areas that the Plastics Industry Association watches closely. What are you seeing in terms of plastics machinery sales? Are there any sectors that are stronger than others right now? And what direction are things heading in when you look at orders in addition to sales?
I'm not sure if our latest media report has been released, but if I could give a preview of what that will be, we have actually seen an increase in the shipments value of single and twin screw extruders on a year-over-year basis. And so that's a positive, but for other categories, numbers are actually down. And that's not surprising considering that the economy is not doing well. If the economy is doing well and you see all the shipments and machineries are actually down, then you know that there's a problem somewhere that's probably more structural in nature than what's going on in the economy. In terms of growth, probably machineries that would actually enhance the production capacities of the processors, because if you think about it, production of plastics hasn't really stopped. Those who would optimize production, so you're talking about auxiliary equipment, for example, those that offer solutions to plastics processing would actually would remain healthy for this year, I would imagine. those that extend the life of processing machines, for example, would be healthy for this year. But overall, on a year-over-year basis, business is actually lower than 2019.
So that makes sense, since the biggest sector, or the biggest slice of the pie when we're talking about machinery is injection molding, and the biggest end-use customer for that is automotive. And automotive right now, it's shut down, and nobody's going to be adding capacity when they're shut down, or not very much. But it's interesting that extruders are up, and that could be a case where either companies are modernizing or they're adding capacity for PPE, which we talked about earlier. There's great demand for PPE products right now.
Right. I mean, the underlying demand for plastics products are still positive. I mean, they're still healthy. Although we're seeing some bumpy quarter-over-quarter data, but the demand is not going to go away anytime soon, as I see it. We've seen capacity utilization much lower. In April, what is it? In April, 65.3%. And from a year ago, that was 76%. And so you see that business has actually gone down dramatically. It's rather unfortunate that despite all this low interest rate environment, because these are capital intensive machineries, despite the low interest rates, it is really the weak aggregate demand in the economy that's causing a lot of businesses to stay on the sidelines and postpone whatever investment spending and equipment they have. But my sense is, as they see these things change, beginning in the third and onto the fourth quarter, that you would see more action in terms of new orders and coating activity in the plastics machinery space.
Okay. So another big sector, Bill, we'll turn to you for this one. Another big sector for plastics is the materials side. What are your expectations for the materials market? I'm keeping in mind there's a lot of new capacity coming online in North America right now, and some of those suppliers were definitely expecting to export a lot of that material globally. Are we going to see exports happening? Is the market going to absorb all this additional capacity?
Eventually, the market will absorb all of it, and I think they're going to, the projects that have been postponed or slowed down will come back online. The materials sector, as you know, is heavily influenced by the energy sector. And energy got kind of a double whammy. There was this problem with Saudi and Russia supposedly in the first quarter that pushed energy prices down. Had to do a lot with production in North America, particularly the U.S. production. Supply was exceeding demand, and that pushed prices way down. And then demand took a further hit, obviously, when everybody decided they had to stay home, or they didn't decide, but they were told to stay home. But the commodity cycle looks like it's hit bottom. Energy prices are starting to rebound. They're not tremendously high yet, but it looks like they put in a bottom. Eventually, they will get the supply and demand curves equilibrated. And at that point, North America will continue to have the advantage over the long term in natural gas prices and natural gas supply and other feedstock materials. And so all of those plans that were made and those investments that were outlined should come back online. I don't think we have seen a permanent disruption in demand for plastics globally, global growth, in population growth globally. There are still some of the emerging market countries that haven't really gone through their peak for the coronavirus, and they're still struggling with that. But from a long-term perspective, I don't think the disruption will be permanent. In the short term, I don't think it's going to turn around this year or perhaps even next as far as that whole investment in new materials capacity.
So that maybe there's an implication there that you're thinking that the low oil prices right now is a temporary situation, and natural gas is going to in the longer term be competitive. Am I reading you correctly?
Yes. I think that there are these longer term secular trends and forces that will continue to push the price of fossil fuels down, gasoline and heating oil and that kind of thing, as the economy gradually switches over to other forms of fuel. But that's a very long-term thing. There's still going to be a cycle, several cycles within that, and commodity cycles. And I think we've hit bottom with regard, or we're, very near, in the longer-term perspective. So yes, oil prices will rise again. They're very cyclical. At the moment, I think the silver lining is that low energy prices are sort of like a tax break for consumers. So they don't have to spend a lot of this money that they're getting in the mail from the government in form of their check for energy, because they're not driving anywhere, and the weather's warming up, and that kind of thing. So that's a silver lining for kind of jump starting things, but I don't think it's permanent.
Okay, I thought we would get into some of the sectors, but since we have so many viewer questions right now, let's hit those first. What I'll do, unless one of the questions is addressed to one of you specifically, I'll read the question, and then if you want to answer it, just jump into it, and then we'll get as many as we can. So the first question, which looks like is very popular, how do you feel that the economy is positioned if there will be a second wave in the fall and winter? So a lot of people are looking at maybe a bad scenario of a second wave of COVID and maybe shutting down the economy again. How do you feel about the economy is positioned? How would that change your forecast?
Well, let me start. If we have a second wave, we already know what an economic shutdown looks like currently. It would probably be the same as what we're going through, and the worst of it is going to be in the second quarter. So you can think about it in terms of the economy staying in the trough much, much longer, as opposed to the economy improving gradually. And so there has been, and there's still a lot of discussion on the shape of the recovery in terms of the letter of the alphabet, U, J, whatever the case may be. Some of them have actually espoused a W shape of recovery. The issue is we don't know what that uptick is in the W. Is that a local minimum, a local maximum, or whatever that is? And so then we would probably be staying there for quite some time if there's going to be another outbreak in the fall. But knowing what we know now, we have some changes in our economy that has actually happened because of the coronavirus pandemic. In terms of its effects in the plastics industry, for example, we talked about the services sector earlier. If we are reopening, that would actually lead to more consumption of products that are contained in plastic bottles, for example, disinfectants, masks, and all those kinds of things. So overall, the economy would probably be like the same as what we're going through right now, but it's probably not going to affect the demand for plastics that much. It's not going to be that different as what's going on right now, considering that we would have to be doing all this efforts to contain the virus in the second wave.
Here's a question. It's about chemical recycling, which is maybe a little surprising, but that's a question is, what are you hearing about plastic crude, where technologies have emerged using pyrolysis to reduce end-of-life plastic back into oil, which is bought by plastics manufacturers to make new recycled plastic? I guess maybe I would add some context to this and say we know it's a technology that does work. At the same time, does it make sense in a low feedstock environment? Does chemical recycling work, and maybe what impact is that going to have on the industry, especially when we're talking about meeting circular economy goals? Bill, would you like to tackle that one?
I'll say this about it. I have heard of that. I know that it works. I think it's, the proof of concept is already there. As far as market viability, in the short term, no. That's not going to be something, I think, because right now that we don't have an infrastructure. Right now the idea is to get as many people back to work as we can, and to do that we're probably going to go back to our old way of doing things, which is making things out of virgin material and mining fossil fuels and that kind of thing. However, let me say this, from a longer term perspective, that is the kind of thing that we need more of those ideas. We need more of that kind of research. We need more of that R&D and development. We need investment in those angles. That will pay off down the road. We learned about this in just recently, just to draw the analogy to the whole concept of how we're defeating the coronavirus. We had an amazing infrastructure, pharmaceutical therapies and those kinds of things already in place, and we had knowledge and we had understanding. The time it's taking to go from the onset of the pandemic to having a reliable vaccine is so compressed. History's never seen it. We have literally 100 vaccines currently being tested, and I have to believe that at least one, and probably more of those we're going to hit on. But the investment in the infrastructure and the technology that it takes to respond to that kind of a problem has to be made in advance. And so if we're going to get to a sustainable circular thing, we have to make it in advance. We can't just wait until we run out of raw materials to decide, okay, now maybe it'd be a good time if we invested in researching some other types of things. So, I'm very interested and keen on those ideas. For the next 6 months, maybe even the next 6 quarters, we'll kind of use the Bill Gates analogy. The next 2 years, not going to happen. Less than 10, though. Less than 10.
Okay. So here's a question for Perc. Perc, you talked up front. You mentioned the idea of maybe another $2 or $3 trillion in stimulus and what impact that would have on the economy. So here's the other side of the coin. This person wants to know, how do you see the huge U.S. debt and impacting the economy in the plastics industry?
Yeah, well, eventually it's going to be a drag in the economy if we continue borrowing and borrowing. And so these things need to be spent on things that would actually create more jobs, things that would actually sustain economic growth. Otherwise, it will just be a spending that doesn't go anywhere. One of the things, though, that the politicians are not looking at the moment is there is so much money in the financial market at the moment. If you would look at personal savings, what is the total savings of deposits and all of depository institutions in May? It actually was $11.01 trillion. And from a year ago, that was $9.4 trillion. A lot of people have started savings because they don't like to spend because of the uncertainty. There is enough capital in the financial markets at the moment that we could actually deploy to get the economy moving. We've been through this before during the financial crisis. Despite low interest rates, banks were not lending. Banks would need to start lending this $11 trillion worth of money that's sitting there. Even if you go to a negative interest rate, so you penalize banks for not lending money, right? But what would that negative interest rate be? Negative 25 basis points. That would still be less than the amount of risk that banks would probably bear if they would lend money to, given the current economic condition. And so unless we get the economy opening up again, and we'll see how much labor absorption capacity in our economy there will be, and if consumer confidence ticks up, business investment spending starts to improve, then probably we don't need all that debt that we're about to be assuming at sometime soon if it gets passed.
Okay. So Bill, here's a related question to that. We can go back to our Econ 101 and consider this one. Do you think that the addition to the national debt will devalue the U.S. dollar dangerously?
I think there's a risk of that. I think we have to talk about this in terms of risk and risk management. And I think that there is a very significant risk. In other words, it's not negligible. We can't ignore it. On the other hand, our understanding of demand for money, capital, the U.S. Place in the world, interest rates, aggregate demand from the developed nations, demographic growth, and that kind of thing. It's not clear to me that that risk is obviously going to happen. We may get out of this. And so to say that the dollar will not be dangerously devalued wouldn't be appropriate. To say that if it gets devalued a little or inflation rises some, and we're able to pay off our debts with inflated dollars, moderately inflated dollars, and economy rebounds more strongly as a result, that would be something that it might be a silver lining. So I'm with Perc on his, I don't think we need the government printing more money. I think it's, I think what we have plenty of capital. We have plenty of money. What we need are ideas, initiative, leadership, and a change in sort of cultural consumption behavior. That kind of sounds vague and squishy, but what we choose to do with our money would go a long way to fixing that.
The next question, I think we answered it already, but looks people keep continuing to like it, so maybe we'll take another look at it. Prices for virgin resins have and continue to drop with the cost of oil decreasing. Many companies have made claims to use recycled plastics. Do you see the industry being able to live up to its promises to use recycled resins? Again, I think we kind of covered this. Is there more to say? Do you expect that they'll be able to live up to the promises? Some of the rates and dates that we're looking at are still a few years down the road. So maybe they can still play catch up, I think.
Well, I think to the extent that the industry needs to invest in infrastructure, I think they can easily meet the investment in the infrastructure needs they need to make. The question is, do they have access to recycled supply? Are consumers choosing to recycle? And then on the market acceptance, are they choosing to purchase products made of recycled material? And those are still open questions. And it's a chicken and an egg kind of a thing. Are we going to get demand for recycled product? Are we going to get the supply of recycled product post-consumer? I think the technologies are there. Willingness to invest in infrastructure is clearly there. If you look at entrepreneurs and some of the businesses that have started to do this, especially in the younger generation, it just boils down to market acceptance. If when that customer is in the store looking at various products, what is driving their demand? What's making the choice for them? Is it price? Is it materials? Is it point of origin? Why are they choosing what they're choosing?
Even before the economic slowdown, we knew that there would have been problems with OEMs, with brand owners having enough recycled material to meet the goals that they've set. There's already a supply issue there. I don't think that things have gotten better in the past few months as a result of that. But maybe the question is this a temporary or a permanent situation? Hopefully, I don't think either one of you is saying it's permanent. So.
We needed to come up with a homeschooling module for all the parents schooling their kids on the benefits of recycling and the how-tos of making sure we take total ownership for a product once we take it home from the store.
Okay. We've got some more questions here. So how do you value the security of a supply chain when calculating the cost of a part? Otherwise, there's no driver to move production to the U.S. where nominal costs will be higher. Currently, we do not value the security at all, just net cost. Seems like it's more of a statement than a question. Probably a good point, though, that if you're looking at net cost and how do you convince your customer that there's more to it than that? There's people out there who specialize in that and helping companies to tell that story, I think. Yeah.
I think that's the silver lining of this crisis. Is that is it in a nutshell. This is the cost. We went from, the big thing was just in time inventory control and low cost supply of our supply chains, and now how did that work with PPE? How did that work with ventilators? How did that work when we had a real situation on our hands? So now we may be moving a little bit more, at least in those areas, to just in case, where we actually have supplies, where we actually have domestic suppliers. And that's this is just not going to happen in Meta. We know about pharmaceutical products. We know about electronics, strategic things that we have allowed to slip away because all we wanted to do was everyday low prices.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't make a veiled threat like that at a particular retailer, because I think they're trying to turn around too, but or take a swipe like that. But we got to stop. Cost does not equal value.
I think it's encouraging that there's a manufacturing policy and that there is recognition that it's important.
It's really one
Yes.
of those risks that you're just not aware of, and you could play around and model it and do some sensitivity analysis of what would happen if X, this, and that. It's going to be an exercise, the columns of spreadsheet, but whether or not you could capture everything, it is just so difficult. Like, we never thought that the economy would actually be closed. We were all looking for what would be the next sign of the next recession, and nobody could tell us. And we didn't know that it was the coronavirus. And so it's the same thing with pricing your product, how we could create all the scenarios, but then the bottom line is, are you still competitive? And so that's really what it amounts to.
Here's a question, signed question. Bill mentioned costs as the key element for manufacturing. What percentage of regulations as compared to straight labor make up those costs? Bill, does that one, would you like to tackle that?
I don't have a sense overall.
Mm-hmm.
I know that we are about to add a bunch of regulations onto everybody, because they can now only seat so many people in their building or in their place of work. They have to have shields up everywhere. Everybody has to be regulated and moderated and checked out before they enter into the room or exit the room or enter onto the plane or whatever. Regulation, if you read any of these guidelines for how we're going to reopen, I mean, that is just a gigantic stack of regulation. I don't know what the percentage is of regulation versus all that. I just know that regulation just took a huge jump up. I can see the trend from here without my glasses, is that we just got really regulated, and that's going to be kind of a problem.
Perc, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, judging from memory, and if my memory still serves me, there was a study before that looked at the cost of regulation per capita. And they came up with federal regulations are actually costing Americans about $14,000 a year. And this was a study 10 or 12 years ago. So then that really slows demand for goods and services in the economy. If you factor it into the manufacturing activity of a business, then you would see that it's a substantial amount. To begin with, business owners are also consumers to begin with. And so we're both sides of the same coin. And so there is, in fact, a cost on manufacturing. And I'm sure some other organizations have studied this, but I can't remember on top of my head what that number is. But I'd be more than happy to look at it and send those numbers or estimates to whoever asked the question.
Okay, good. Oh, we've got a lot of questions and we're running out of time, but we'll hit a few more and people can stay with us. So this one has a quite a few likes. Do you think that the pandemic may give a new value to single-use plastic items for hygienic purposes? I think it's something that we've kind of covered, but what do you think of this question? Either one of you?
The answer is yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I never had a problem. The nuance, single-use items is a nuanced argument. We got hit over the head with a blunt instrument, and we lost control of the narrative. But the single-use items have a purpose in the marketplace, and medical and that kind of thing drives that home.
Mm-hmm. What are plastics post-COVID opportunities? For example, UV, biocides, nonwovens, clear or colored, film transfer molding. So any specific either materials or technologies that you're interested in from this list or anything else? I maybe would throw in 3D printing. That might be something we've seen a lot of activity in with 3D printers. Initially, they were probably among the first to be able to move and adjust and make new products. So that's something interesting. What steps is the industry taking to proactively partner with prominent environmentalists who shape society perceptions about the industry to distinguish it from the global problems of waste disposal? Might be a better question if Tony were on the call today with us. He would be the one. I don't know if that this group is right. We have CAFE for fuel economy standards that is federally mandated. Do you feel we need a similar approach for recycling and reusing plastics? Having said that, I am not a proponent for government interference, but we collectively don't seem to be getting there on our own. So someone, I think, reading the tea leaves of what's going on in Washington right now, there's definitely a lot of activity in Washington, which might be headed toward some sort of legislation related to plastics and either encouraging plastics recycling or banning certain products. There's rumblings going on in DC in a bigger way than there have been before. Do you think that approach is needed? Either one of you have an opinion on that?
Well, regulations and approaches that would actually promote improvements in infrastructure, particularly recycling infrastructure, would be a good thing. But if it's just regulation for the sake of regulation, it doesn't really help. We're better off if markets are actually left to develop new products, innovate on their own, but the regulation then should be reversed, that they could get new products and new innovations into the market faster, as opposed to slower because of regulation. And that's how I see it. It's a good thing to do, but I think it's doing it the other way around. Because regardless of what types of materials there will be in the future, let's say it's no longer plastic, that's the king in single use. Let's say there's just an X material. If we still don't have the infrastructure of managing those types of waste, then we would still have the problem. And so if there's regulatory or some support or whatever the case may be that would actually enhance and modernize infrastructure in the whole economy, particularly the recycling infrastructure, that would actually be better than new sets of regulation that would slow down market innovation.
Okay. We'll go with this one last question since we are over time, and it's going back to the machinery side. The question is very specific. Do you expect single and twin screw extruder sales to stay strong in Q3 and Q4? Maybe it's also an opportunity to look at your outlook for other types of machinery, Q3, Q4, and then also into 2021, which is an NPE year. Where do you think machinery sales are going? We'll start with Bill on this one since we heard from Perc on machinery already.
Machinery sales are part of that category, capital equipment, that tend to move very late in the cycle. They don't tend to be the first thing that moves. There's probably a lot of capacity already out there that's sitting idle. Machinery that from bankruptcies or whatever happens negatively to companies that are no longer in business, machinery that comes onto the used market, there may be an overhang of high quality machinery. And so I don't look for the machinery numbers to increase significantly, any capital equipment, any capital spending to increase significantly in the near term. And that's additionally, there's going to be a very significant effort to rehire workers. So prior to this shutdown, there was the dynamic working where there wasn't enough workers and investment was being driven by the need to increase productivity, and you just couldn't find enough manpower to do it. So there was an incentive to invest. I think now the idea is going to be bring workers back, use money that is available, that discretionary funds within each company that you could use to invest in other things, or if the government loans or the PPP, that had nothing to do with buying new capital equipment. That had everything to do with maintaining employment. So I think machinery will be later in the cycle. I do think the timing of the show next year will be auspicious. I think the mood will be upbeat, and I think the trajectory will be up. I think there will be a good opportunity to plan for the next capital cycle and to get ready for it and to sell into it. And so I think from my timing of the cycle dynamics, that's what I see.
Okay. Well, very good. I think that's a good place to stop. We're on a little upbeat note, and I think we probably could spend, you mentioned workforce issues. We could talk for another hour about workforce issues and what impact the virus is having on that. And our viewers would be very interested in that as well. So I would like to thank Bill and Perc for joining me today. Thank for the audience for tuning in and staying with us. And thank our sponsor, the Plastics Industry Association. It was a lot of fun, and I hope that we can do it again.